Clover, hi.
Hello.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for that stellar introduction. I'm gonna take a sip of water.
When you spoke at the COP21 as a 16-year-old girl, you said you wished we should start every conversation by asking one another how we feel. So, dear Clover, how do you feel today and recently?
Thank you for the question. I think the answer to this question changes on a daily basis, oftentimes based on which headlines I've read, who I've spoken to, and how far into the spiral of climate doom I have fallen. But I think bringing our emotions into the conversation is critical when it comes to climate. You know, I've been a climate activist since the age of 11, and for a long time, I felt like I was only permitted to be optimistic about the future. And I was often only given license to be optimistic. I'd have people invite me to events and say, you know, we want the next generation to inspire us, right? We want you to help us feel hopeful. And it wasn't until I started volunteering in classrooms in the UK where I tapped into some very different feelings. So I was 19 when I started volunteering, and I went into these classrooms kind of wanting to teach young people about the climate crisis and about sustainability. And I very quickly learned that they didn't actually need a lesson in climate change. They knew exactly what was happening. They understood the fundamentals of the science. But what I did hear from these young people was a deep and profound sense of grief. I spoke to 11 and 12-year-olds who told me about the apocalyptic dreams that they had of the future. 13-year-old girls who told me they'd already decided they didn't want to have children because they didn't want to bring them into a world on fire. And it helped me to realize just how many young people are really despairing over the future. But hearing those feelings gave me permission, perhaps for the first time in my journey as an activist, to acknowledge just how terrified and powerless I often felt. And off the back of those classrooms, when I founded Force of Nature, we went on to conduct the largest ever survey into youth mental health and climate. So we surveyed 10,000 young people across 10 countries, and we found that 70% of young people are anxious about the climate crisis. And perhaps more scarily, 56% of young people believe that humanity is doomed. And when we hear these statistics, or we hear the young people in our lives giving voice to these feelings, it can be difficult to sit with them. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that eco-anxiety is a very healthy psychological response. When so much in our culture tries to switch us off from the climate crisis, when we're taught to kind of numb ourselves to the deep injustices around the world, when so many people in historic seats of power are sleepwalking, even as the science tells us it's toward a cliff of environmental collapse. Eco-anxiety, or whatever you want to call it, is a really, really healthy response. It's evidence of the internal alarm bells telling us that something is really wrong. The key is understanding how can we channel those feelings into action so that they don't ferment into a kind of powerlessness and apathy and feeling that it's just too big to solve.
Yeah. And I assume you found your own way to deal with your eco-anxiety by founding Force of Nature.
Yeah.
So tell me about the organization. What is it?
Yeah, that's one way of coping. Start an organization that will really stress you out. So yeah, Force of Nature really started with this mission of helping young people around the world kind of develop their emotional literacy, right? Most of us aren't actually taught about our feelings, how to name them, but also how to cultivate things like agency. So we worked with psychologists and educators around the world to develop programs to take young people on this journey to realizing what a gift and what a superpower it is to feel so deeply, right? The pain we experience is the flip side of the love that we have for the earth and for our communities, and that is a beautiful thing. But then connecting young people to, okay, rather than feeling overwhelmed by the number of issues, how do I find impact from focus? So we help young people through training programs identify, these are the issues that ignite a fire in my belly, and these are the skills that I can cultivate to show up and solve them. So we've run programs with tens of thousands of young people around the world. And 2 years ago, we also launched an initiative called Climate Cafes. And we've now had a few hundred climate cafes around the world. We've provided micro grant funding to young people, particularly in the global south, to be able to start these initiatives. And what's so cool is when you give young people just a little bit of resource, a little bit of validation and support, they're able to do so much. So from small micro grants like £200, young people in other countries have gone on to start their own initiatives, their own organizations, which are focused on community action and critically resilience, which I think is not talked about enough in climate. Whether, as you mentioned, it's the flooding in Valencia or the terrifying headlines that have come out of the UN this week that are really just honest about the path we're on, the fact that we're on track for 3 degrees of warming. It's heavy. And we need to talk about how as societies and how as communities we don't drive further into division and polarization and fear, and how we really focus on solidarity and connection and community building, particularly when there are so many forces around us that would otherwise divide us.
Sorry for asking, but do you sell the classes, or how is the organization financed?
Yeah, so we're funded through different philanthropic donors and foundations. All of our programs are entirely free for young people. It's really important to us that finance is never a barrier, and we've gone one step further to do research and understanding what the financial barriers are to young people into activism, and then actively funding those young people to participate in programs, participate in trainings. Most of activism is completely unpaid, and that's not really something we talk about very often. I was recently at New York Climate Week, and all of these incredible young activists, many of whom I'm sure you know from, Mitzi Janelle Tan, an incredible activist from the Philippines, through to Vanessa Nakate, Daphne Frias. Anyway, they're all there, and we had this very candid conversation where we asked one another, we're getting invited into these big organizations to go and speak, big corporations, which obviously have huge resources. Are any of you getting compensated for your time? No. Are any of you having your travel fees covered? No. And the most extreme example of this, my friend Daphne, she is an incredible disability justice activist and climate activist. She's in a wheelchair. She lives in New York. She was invited to maybe 20 events in that single week, and she was unable to attend most of them because the organizers were unwilling to pay for a van to transport her in her wheelchair from her home to the venue. And that just shows as well how, why the climate space is often very middle class, very white.
Yeah.
There are so many barriers that prohibit people without those privileges from participating. And it's also one of the factors that contributes to widespread burnout within activism, because it's not just a hugely overwhelming existential crisis. You're also constantly figuring out how you're going to be able to put food on the table.
Absolutely. How do you see the role of corporates? Are you working together with some corporates?
Yeah, so before I started Force of Nature, I was working as a sustainability consultant. So I would work with companies on decarbonizing their supply chains and how to reach net zero, very sexy subjects like that. And I became increasingly frustrated. I think, when I started out as an activist, I made a lot of mockumentaries about big companies. So I remember making an ad about Dove and how orangutan tears were the secret ingredient in their Ultra Shine shampoo range. So that was my way of kind of talking about the issues. But I remember thinking, these companies are the bad guys, right? And then I went into those organizations and I realized, actually, these companies are made up of lots of people who are very similar to me, share the same visions and aspirations, want, a beautiful world for their children, but are deeply entrenched within that system and feel really powerless to change it. So, I had conversations with the CEOs of multi-billion-dollar corporations employing tens of thousands of people. And they would say to me, okay, but I'm just one person. What do you expect me to do? And I'm like, okay, you objectively have so much influence, so much power. If that's the way you're thinking, what hope is there for any of us? And I think particularly the past few years have shown just how much backtracking there has been. So in the wake of the Paris Agreement, there was this excitement and energy, right? And real hope about the role of business being able to push for change. And yet in the past couple of years, we've seen companies making record-breaking profits and simultaneously reversing their climate commitments. There was a study last year that found that 58% of major corporations have put forward climate commitments that are in direct opposition to their own lobbying activities. So they're saying one thing and they're doing something very different. Similarly, a study from Deloitte, they interviewed business leaders around the world and they said, what's the number one benefit of taking action on sustainability? And they didn't say addressing the climate crisis, they said public perception, right? So if companies or business leaders are moving, it's often grounded in a place of greenwashing and how can we be seen to do the right thing rather than actually getting on and doing it. So I don't have faith that companies are going to do the right or ethical thing from the goodness of their hearts, because the entire economic system is inherently extractive. And whether it's business leaders or people shopping in the supermarket or young people, we live in a time where it's fundamentally difficult to do the right or responsible thing. And so much more of my focus recently has gone into regulation and how we actually implement policies that aren't trusting in companies, but that are going to force them to move.
It's hard to hear, to be honest. What's the biggest challenge you face as a climate activist at the moment? If you can point out one.
Yeah. There are a lot. I'd say more recently, I think just trying to hold the reality of where we are has been really difficult. Most climate scientists are, of the consensus that the 1.5 degree threshold is way out of reach. And to avoid the 1.5 degree tipping point, we need to be reducing global emissions by 7% each year, and we're currently increasing emissions by 1% each year. So the math ain't mathing. And it's hard and it's shitty, to be honest. To go out and do this work and constantly be questioning, am I doing the most that I can, right? And, how much of myself can I give to this without burning out and exhausting myself? Activism, I'm sure many of you relate to this, working in climate and sustainability, social impact. It's not a 9 to 5. You don't go home and just switch off, right? It's existential. And it intersects with every part of how we live, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, how we get around the places we live. And, so much of my work is around empowering people to realize that change is possible. And yet when you're up against this kind of tide, not just of what's happening, in terms of the climate crisis, but when you look at the conflicts unfolding around the world, when you look at the genocide in Palestine, when you look at the American election and the deep political division, when you look at the Green New Deal in Europe and how it was kind of appropriated to drive further, fascism in the continent, it's hard not to just feel like, oh my God, this is so much. And trying to sit in that and keep doing the work, I think, is really difficult. But definitely having a spiritual practice has really helped me focus less of the worth of my actions on the outcomes, which are fundamentally outside of my control, but just focus on doing the work that I know is important, because I honestly want to be able to look back on my life and know that I did everything in my power.
Yeah. This is worth every applause. The media gives us the impression that it's mainly young women leading the climate movement. Is that your perception too, or is it just the media focusing on these protagonists?
Unfortunately, yes, I would say that is true. It's largely women and young women.
Why? What do you think? Why?
It's a tough one. I think there are so many aspects to this. One theory I have is that when you experience injustice in your own life, whether that is because you are a woman and you experience, gender-based injustice, or you're a person of color and you experience racism, or you have a disability and you experience ableism. I think when you have an experience, it deepens your empathy and capacity to connect with other people who are in marginalized situations. So I think that is an aspect of why the climate movement is not just predominantly women, but also there are a lot of queer people, myself included, a lot of people of color, a lot of people who have been failed by the system and want to do something about it. So I think there is a dimension of privilege. But then there's also, how people are socialized in society. And I think as young women, we're socialized to kind of be nurturing and to look after our communities. And I think a lot of young men have been taught that something very different is aspirational, right? Having a particular type of career and pursuing, higher and higher salaries and pursuing a certain job title. And how we can see how certain male influencers, the extreme end being like Andrew Tate, are really trying to appeal to quite an old school, archaic version of what it means to be a man. So when young men are, engaging in climate spaces, they can be seen as like too femme or, too weak, which is insane.
Yeah.
But it was very telling. I remember one of the very first, climate classes we kind of hosted. There were maybe 8 young women and 2 young men. And one of the men, he said, "This is the first time in my life I've ever talked about my mental health."
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This is the first time I've ever talked about my mental health with other people. And so I think there's an element as well of, young men don't necessarily feel like they will be valued in these spaces, or they don't even necessarily have the language to get there in the first place.
So great that you can create a safe space for all of them. It's
Yeah,
amazing.
and we need like more male role models as well, who model what a different type of leadership looks like, a leadership that is grounded in empathy and caring and community.
Absolutely. A recent study showed that women between ages of 18 and 24 are the group with the greatest desire for leadership. It's 43%. No other age or gender group had so much desire for the topic. And I'm pretty sure that role models like you and Luisa and Greta are playing a big role in that. And I'm in complete awe of that fact. So thank you very much for your role model and leadership.
Thank you. Thank you.
Goosebumps. Look at that. Got goosebumps. This is so important, really. What advice would you give to those suffering from eco-anxiety?
The first thing I would say is that it's, again, a very healthy response. And it's normal to feel like a little gaslit sometimes. I remember when I first started talking about eco-anxiety, journalists would say to me, "Okay, but isn't this just the snowflake generation? Like Gen Z are just finding another thing to be upset about."
Yeah.
Like, okay, that's one impression of what's happening here. But interestingly, actually, a lot of people within climate as well kind of said to me, like, "Don't you think this is just like a bit too doomist? Like, isn't it just a bit depressing?" And
Where's
I'm like,
the fun in it?
yeah, and I've been invited to events before where I've been explicitly asked, this sounds crazy saying it out loud, but I've been asked, "Could you please not use the term climate crisis because we're worried that language might make people a bit anxious."
You should work on your marketing.
So I think there's a real allergy to, sitting in the reality of what's happening, touching on our grief, allowing ourselves, permitting ourselves to feel the full depth of those emotions. And again, we don't necessarily have the skills to be able to do that, but I find that connecting with other people is a really powerful starting point, right? It's easy to feel isolated in our work, whether it's as an activist or it's someone, working within a company and you're trying to be that agitator swimming against the status quo all the time, or you're that person at the dinner table who's trying to have a frank conversation getting shut down. We're operating in lots of spaces where we're not going to necessarily feel seen or heard. And that's why it's so incredibly important to find those peers, to find that community wherever you're trying to create change. And that's, my source of inspiration are the young people that I get to work with every day, because I'm so impressed by their moral clarity, their ability to call out the bullshit, their ability to discern real solutions from just token ones or more greenwashing, but really just their capacity for care. I find that really deeply inspiring. So I would say if you're feeling these feelings, which is totally normal, and even if you're feeling something else like numb or powerless, right? There's no right answer. Create space to feel, find others who are in a similar boat, and then really think about, rather than feeling that overwhelm of, I have to do everything, remembering like this room is testament to the fact that there are so many people who care deeply, who are trying to create that change. And so rather than feeling you have to do all of the things, identify what that piece of the puzzle is for you, right? What is that problem that you're deeply passionate about? And then as the previous speaker spoke to, like, what are the unique skills or aspects of who you are that you can use to solve that, right? I love that he spoke to being like neurodivergent, and it's something that, Greta spoke to quite candidly as well. Like, part of the reason why she's able to like call people out, she attributes to the fact that she's neurodivergent. She's not necessarily playing by the same social standards that everyone else is. And so identifying like what is that unique thing that you have, that you are, and how do you bring that into the movement?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess you've experienced a lot. What forms of activism do you think it's most effective today? Online activism, political activism, disobedience, civil disobedience, what would you think?
I would say we need absolutely everything. There is no silver bullet solution, as much as that would be fantastic if we could just tick one box. We need all approaches. And for me, I want to see just more people putting up their hand and saying, I'm an activist, whether that is going out in the streets, participating in movements like Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil, or it is being that agitator at the dinner table or that agitator in the boardroom. We need everyone collectively having the courage to stand up and say, what's happening is not right, and we're capable of doing so much better. And the reality is, it's not always comfortable. Actually, it's often deeply uncomfortable. A few months ago, I was invited to speak at an award ceremony for business leaders. And as I was going up on stage, I noted that some of the award recipients were pretty iconic polluters and contributors to climate change. And so I got on the stage and I started simply relaying the facts. I shared the latest climate science. I shared where we're at, the responsibility of business. And people in this room started to boo and heckle.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah. And one of them shouted from the front row, "That's not fair." Basically, the fact that I was saying business has a responsibility to address climate change. And all to say, I abandoned my script. I told her what I thought was not fair, the fact that people in the global south are paying with their lives due to the inaction of people in rooms like that one. And then I marched off the stage and had a big cry.
Good to hear that. It's very honest.
And the day after, I got a bunch of LinkedIn DMs and messages from people who were in the audience who said, thank you so much for, calling out business as usual, right? And one of them said that it had been like sitting in first class on the Titanic. All these people in business suits, sitting around drinking glasses of champagne. And I was glad to hear that the message had gotten through. But the thing that I was struck by was that none of them had chosen to speak out in that moment. Mm-hmm. And what a difference it would have made.
Absolutely.
If I could see that there was just one person in that room of 300 who got it and who was standing there in solidarity with me. And so we need to be able to do the hard things. And oftentimes the hardest thing is not being that first person to speak out, but being the second person who says, yeah, I agree. I think we really need to create change. I think we need to do the hard stuff. Thank you. Thank you.
Our time is running out. I'm so sad. I could sit here and talk with you for hours.
Oh.